maze. So I asked you to practice. This is what we know of as some of the typical symbols in a kinship chart, which people outside of anthropology use a lot now. If you go on ancestry.com or other places, people like tracing their genealogies and figuring out if they're related to King Arthur or not. And yeah. As you can tell, I'm not so into it myself, but it's interesting. And in part, we can thank anthropology for helping us out with all these symbols, and they're not universally used, but anthropology in some ways gifted them to us. So I guess that leads us to one of the things about the anthropological kinship chart, which many of you noticed, right? As long as things are like, I don't want to say standard, but as long as their families are looking kind of like this, it's like great. You're just zinging along. But the moment somebody does something out of the ordinary, and again, I shouldn't use those words, but you know what I mean. So the moment somebody does something that is a little bit different, I mean, even one new relationship you saw, she's like going off in the upper realm and coming down into the, it gets confusing almost immediately, and then everything goes, it's like it works well as long as everybody stays in their lane, but if somebody goes, and even if life happens to you, a couple marriages and you're good. Jada?
Oh, I was gonna ask for like the kinship like chart. Like I saw how she like made a line for when her mother like has siblings. So like would there be any distinction between like full blooded siblings or like half siblings or like step siblings, or would it just still like be the same like sibling?
Yeah, I mean, again, that's one of those complexities, right? I mean, you can try to make it out and you can try to draw it so that, maybe but immediately, and especially then if you go back to grandparents and I mean, it gets really complicated in ways that I don't think the anthropologists really were thinking about. Yeah.
I found it kind of interesting how the presumption that if two people are married, their children is going to be their children, whether it's, things like adoption or if there was like an affair going on.
Yeah, I mean, this is heavily weighted towards, the legitimation of marriage. So
Yeah.
if you have a relationship, you only get a single line. You don't get the double line, which you give to the, you get a single line only. But yeah, Kath.
I think it was difficult to try and figure out what to do with like illegitimate siblings or children.
Right, and
especially if you don't know the other person, like they were married and they just were like, fuck it. Ran over to the next one and then a couple years later came back. So then you don't know that woman, she could be dead. She could have 75 other children. She could have,
well, probably at most 12. But I mean, reproductive life, you can get up to about 15 maybe. But you're right. The point of the matter is, I mean, even our words for that, right? What, calling someone an illegitimate.
I don't think
Right. I know. I'm not saying, I'm just saying that those are our words, right? Well, those are words we've been taught to use to people who are coming from an unsanctioned relationship. I mean, which are,
that your parents weren't married.
well, anyway, we'll not get into these terms because we are not using them anymore. We're using nicer language. So, as we know, let's see, as many of you said, this is easy as long as things are easy, but as it gets more complicated, it gets much harder. And also, a lot of you notice that it's difficult, and even she in this instance didn't go beyond her grandparents. Like most of us can't go beyond our grandparents' generation in our heads. And that has to do with something that we learned about in this chapter, that there are different kinds of reckonings of kinship, and that one of the reasons, well, PJ, how do we do our kinship? Why do we have to put our paper in the Sidebar done.
I didn't. Oh, okay.
Why do we put our paper into landscape mode?
Portrait, it would be like really squishy.
It would be really squishy. And why is it so squishy? Why do we have mothers and fathers and then they go out to grandparents on both sides and then they're getting even bigger if we put our great grandparents in? Why is that happening to us? What do we think about who we're related to?
I don't know. If you were just doing like one side of your genetics, it would be okay to use the portrait.
Yes, we believe in our society that we are equally related to the people on our both parent sides, that there is bilateral kinship. And so we would definitely want to start in with our paper like this, because as we go back, it's going to get wider and wider and wider because we're related to everybody. However, in many societies, I mean, many societies are bilateral, but there's also a lot of unilineal societies in which you are not necessarily not related to the people on your mother or father's side to degrees. I mean, you might know about that relationship, but basically you trace your lineage and your inheritance and the things that matter to you back through one side or the other. We may know about patrilineal systems. So in a patrilineal system, your inheritance, your name, all the things that perhaps matter to you are going to be along your father's side. And you might not consider yourself as related to the people on your mother's side. They would not be necessarily part of your lineage. And, you know, I would say, I'm pretty sure that the majority of the world societies have been considered in some ways patrilineal. There are fewer examples of matrilineal societies. However, there are some hugely important ones. Many Native American societies were matrilineal. And in this case, you would trace your lineage, your inheritance, your names, back through the matriline instead of the patriline. And if you can wrap your heads around this, your own father might not be as important to you as your mother's brother, because your mother's brother is part of your lineage. You're related to that person, whereas your father might be off somewhere else in a different matriline. Again, it's hard for us to matrilineal systems are kind of go against what many of us think about, but there are some very prominent examples and they do interesting things. Now, if we were in a unilineal system, I would actually ask you to start portrait mode, because you wouldn't have to go wide. You could go deep very fast in your own head. Most people in unilineal systems can name off 5 generations just off the top of their head. You only have to keep track of one line back. You don't have to keep track of like across 5, 6, no problem. Yeah.
I actually said in my response that I think I would be more comfortable making the unilateral lineal, what I can't speak today. Like a sort of portrait kind of tree, because I don't really know a lot of my family on my father's side, but I have a much closer relationship with my mother and her family, so I could much more easily make that connection than bilateral tree.
Yeah, I mean, so in theory, we are a bilateral society. We're all equal. We sound all bi. However, in practice, well, for one thing, in practice, there are some usually patrilineal aspects of our kinship charts. Usually. Not everybody. Does anybody see the oftentimes obvious patrilineal aspect of your chart?
Last names.
Yeah, so that's, something that we do patrilineally for the most part. Some people are changing. Most people aren't, to be honest. But the other interesting thing is, even though we have that patrilineal aspect of our official chart, is a lot of people have speculated if in US kinship, there is something that we call matrilateral skewing or matrilateral bias. And several of you remarked, not just you, Josie, several of you remarked that you seem closer to your family on your mother's side than on your father's. And this is not uncommon in US society. And some people have speculated that there is this kind of matrilateral skewing. And one of the interesting, perhaps, sources of that is the idea that the women are the ones who have to do all the things that Michaela D. Leonardo back in 1987 in a very often cited article called The Female World of Cards and Holidays. So her idea was that it was almost always the women organizing the birthday parties, the events, sending cards, keeping all the kinship going. And so there's some ways in which you might start feeling more related to the people on the matrilateral side than the patrilateral. Now, there might be some changes here with technology. Nobody wants to mail a card anymore, but it's an interesting idea. Yeah.
I was always sort of under the impression that more so than even that, in my situation, my parents divorced when I was relatively young. So my father kind of just left, and that's not exactly the most uncommon thing in the world, where single mothers have to take care of their kids, and therefore they don't really have a connection with their father's side.
Yeah, certainly there's all sorts of individual variation here. So often when we talk about kinship, we're talking about general terms, but we don't want to override the individual circumstances and variation. So anthropologists got really into kinship. For a long time, they got so into it that if we were here in the 1950s, that would be all we would talk about. To the extent that some people were like, that's not anthropology, that's kinshipology, because we'd be talking about the Hopi kinship and all those things that guests told us about, those little charts. Now, some of this has to do with the work of Lewis Henry Morgan, who's kind of a local hero. He was in sort of the Rochester area and is an alternative to the Franz Boas academic tradition in anthropology, was not really schooled in anthropology, but schooled himself. And so he wrote this book, Systems of Consanguinity, that would be blood, and affinity, that would be marriage of the human family. And basically the idea was that the biology of having to reproduce meant that kinship would be a kind of human universal. And, oh yeah, that's another thing we didn't talk about in the video. There is definitely an assumed heteronormativity in there. That there's like circles are girls, triangles are boys, doesn't even talk about any other shapes, and they all get together and do things. And that was basically the assumption of anthropologists as well, that there was this universal biology, and if people understood it, then that meant you had reached a civilized state of civilization. And that's why Lewis Henry Morgan is actually not seen as the father of American US anthropology, because he's had a lot of things that in some ways could be considered not so great. However, it did produce this idea that in other societies, in societies that ordered themselves along kinship, that understanding the kinship system could reveal some really super interesting things about their society, how it was organized, the way people talk to each other. And so this is a book by Radcliffe Brown from across the pond in the UK, which basically says that in some ways the structure, the social structure, whether that be kinship or other elements of society, would result in a certain functioning of the society. Oversimplifying a lot, but it led to some really interesting, revelations about how people dealt with each other in other societies. So Radcliffe Brown actually did field work in a society that, for example, was very prude when it came to talking about sex. Didn't talk about it, no jokes, just very buttoned down. They didn't like to talk about sex very much. However, he noticed that when a certain man and a certain older woman would come into contact with each other, all of a sudden, all these like teasing, joking, sex stuff would come out. They'd be flirting, pulling at each other. All this stuff that they didn't talk about usually would all be talked about. And then when they went away, everything went back to normal again. And this only happened with some men and one particular woman who was older than that man. Can anybody guess, if you look at your kinship chart, what the relationship of those two people might have been? What is one of the most stereotypically tense relationships in our society? That's if you don't have one of these yet. Yes. In-laws, specifically the mother-in-law. And so what he was saying is that there was a tension in this society of the mother-in-law. And so the way they handled that tension was to make it into a joking relationship. And so between these two, there was never anything actually going to happen, but it was like crazy talk and jokes and blah, blah, to diffuse the tension. And then everybody could kind of live their lives as they wanted to. So, super interesting, right? I mean, the fact that you might either have a kind of all suppressed relationship in there, or you might turn it into jokes based on where you were in the kinship alignment. And in some ways, we found not that people did kinship all the same way. Well, what did we find, Tiana? What did we find here about kinship all over the world? If I start talking to you about matrilateral cross cousins and patrilateral parallel cousins, what would you say about these different societies? Or what did we find? That was an unfair question right there. Did we talk about, if I ask you who your matrilateral cross cousins are, would you know?
I don't know. Probably not.
Probably not, but in other societies, you would have specific words. We just call everybody cousins, but in other societies, it's very important to know who's on your mother's side and who's on your father's side, and you have very different words for those kinds of cousins, which means, let me put it to you this way. Do we all do kinship the same way? No, there we go. Well, we found an incredible diversity of kinship ideas and different ways of relating to each other and drawing these different, well, people don't always draw these charts. We drew them. The anthropologists would draw them, but how people named these things, they were all over the map, you might say. And, that's why people got excited about trying to classify different societies by their kinship system. The reason that in some ways matrilateral, especially matrilateral cross cousins, are important, say in a patrilineal society, is even something that people thought was, there's an incest taboo in every society. But where those lines are drawn are going to be different in different societies. So if you were in a patrilineal society, your matrilateral cross cousins are not actually that related to you. They're off in the distance. So you might know them and have fun with them, and they might be seen as, I don't want to freak anybody out, but good marriage partners, because you're not really related. Anyway, there's actually never been a consensus on why people have an incest taboo. People want to say it's because inbreeding, but actually it doesn't biologically work that way. Even the geneticists say, it's not so bad. Don't do it over multiple generations, but. All right, so this led to a whole bunch of thinking about the ideas about descent and the kinship patterns that would come up. And one of the most famous anthropological books of all time by E. Evans Pritchard, called The New Air, was about how people in a non-state society, in a society that did not have a governmental structure, were nevertheless able to organize themselves and, in fact, to do things on a larger scale. And what Evans Pritchard said is that it had a lot to do with the way they did lineages and their lineage-like organization. So this used to be kind of required reading in anthropology classes. It's got some really great writing and lines in it too. But as we revisited this stuff, a couple of things seemed to emerge about the kinship idea. One was that actually the people who seem most obsessed with kinship are like Brits like E. Evans Pritchard, who were really concerned about their coat of arms and, like I said, finding their relationship to King Arthur.
Yeah.
They were obsessed with that, even perhaps more than the people that were studying. And so anthropologists became obsessed with this and would go in and ask people about it, but they wouldn't necessarily. Sometimes the anthropologists perhaps were more into this than the people themselves. The other thing that people found out on re-looking at this is that oftentimes there is a big difference between the rules, the official chart, and the lived experience. So oftentimes the anthropologists would go in and they'd talk to like the official person. And the official person had, the official kinship ideas, the legitimate children, the relationships that made it, and they'd only talk about those. So instead of talking about things that they didn't want to talk about, they'd just talk about, the things that worked out right. And then the charts work because, you eliminate life. Just don't bother with that stuff. And so at an official level, you came up with all these rules, but what they figured out is that actually on a day-to-day level, a lot of people didn't necessarily follow all those rules, or didn't necessarily, even the new era who were said to be patrilineal and fiercely patrilineal, on a practical level, actually did recognize bilateral relationships. The other thing about when Evans Pritchard was doing his research is he was doing it at a time that the new era were fighting against British colonialism. And he was in fact trying to figure out how they were able to organize themselves in the absence of having a government. Now let me ask you this. If you're fighting in a war, who are the first people, if you're in a war situation, who are the people that you can depend upon and trust? Yeah, you're going to start organizing yourselves along family lines. And so in some ways you could say that because of the position that the new era were at the time experiencing as fighting against the Brits, yeah, they were all revved up on kinship. They were all talking about lineages and who could be trusted and who could be mobilized to fight the conflict. So all right, so what is marriage? In this chapter, we learn, as we've always known, that marriage has a lot to do with organizing people's resources, inheritance, making sure you're a legitimate child, because legitimate means you can inherit stuff from your parents and you'd have legal right to it, and making alliances politically with people. Traditionally, this is a very important thing, and you would not want to leave that up to the kids. You would want to arrange this ahead of time to make sure people were making the right choices. Well, you made the choice. You helped guide them along the choices they should make so they could do what they're supposed to do. Now you might ask, as Guest does, what about love? Where does love come in? Some of you are shaking your heads because it doesn't matter. Now, love matters. It does matter. I'm just going to say that, people all over the world, in many times in different places, have experienced what we might call love. It is something that people in all societies talk about. And even those people who are in an arranged marriage might talk about whether they love their spouse or not. And in many arranged marriage societies, it's something that you grow into over time. So they'll say things like, I didn't love him when we got married, but over time, this has developed. So I guess, it's not just us who care about love. It's been something that has been in many different societies. That said, the idea that you would base your marriage on a romantic attraction is seen as in many societies as nutty, because everybody knows, well, let's put it this way. How often have you experienced that you're in a relationship and then all of a sudden you fall in love and the relationship is over. Some people speculate that falling in love is what we use to get out of relationships more than it is when we get into them. Yeah, I know. Sounds crazy. Anyway, we all know that being romantic love, they would say that's fine, but it's too fragile to base a marriage on. Now, that said, well, let me just say, where did we get the idea that romantic love is the basis for marriage, even in our own societies? This probably came about maybe in the last couple hundred years. For those of you who are readers of the Jane Austen novel series, you know that, there's a lot of things going on other than just romantic love, even in what we might consider European and societies. Now, as Gus discusses, a lot of people around the world have talked about using love as the basis for marriage. In fact, it seems to be on the rise. I said seemed because some people actually have become disillusioned with this. So there's a whole series of films in, say, Bollywood, where they talk about, doing a love marriage, but now going back to kind of the more traditional marriages because the love marriages don't work out. But in any case, what we might call globalization or the idea of romantic love has become an important issue for people around the world. But in the olden days, or I guess I would say it's relatively recent that we would see it as the only basis for marriage. Guest discusses a couple of complex anthropological ideas that have to do with marriage, exogamy and endogamy. So exogamy means marrying outside of a certain group. As we talked about, all societies have certain lines that you have to marry outside of. For example, the incest taboo, or you want to marry outside of your village or outside of your family. So all societies have guidance on marrying outside of your two immediate kin. But most societies, whether they admit them or not, have also ideas about who you should marry or endogamy within a certain group. Maybe it's a religious preference. Maybe it's a ethnicity or race preference. There are different ways in which people tell us who we should get married. In the United States, we don't believe that we have any rules about this. We just have love. However, despite our apparent lack of rules, almost all marriages, I would say 95%, if I had to name a number, sociologists might have a better number for me, are endogamous by social class. That is, the wealthy marry the wealthy, the working class marry the working class, the upper middle class marry the upper middle class, etc. Very rare that people cross classes to marry each other. You might have some relationships across class, but it's very rare to do this as a marriage. If you don't believe me, try bringing somebody from a different social class home for dinner to your parents' house and see how it goes. See if everybody's happy at the end of dinner. We'll see how, that's one of those things that we don't think about in our own society, but boy, it can get funny. Now, but how is it? How in this country, how do we believe in love? I can marry whoever I want. I'm free to choose. When usually most of our marriages end up being class endogamous and for the most part race endogamous, although, in some ways class might be even more of a factor. How do we do that? How do we give people complete free choice? And yet we end up with statistically endogamous marriages in social class. Yeah.
Well, mostly because of social pressures, particularly how you're raised. If you're, say, for example, an affluent family, your children are probably going to go to a school where there are other affluent children there, and sort of things like that, where society is already constructed in a way where it would be significantly harder for you to go out and talk to people that are not within your social group.
Yeah, in fact, we don't even have to tell them anything. We don't have to put social pressure on you. We just keep you in the same zip code.
Yeah.
So it's like, your zip code, which is mainly organized by how much your housing costs, and that's the most huge factor of where people live, is the amount they can afford for a house, is also a way of keeping everybody basically at the same level together. And then you end up in the same schools. So, you can choose from all the people around you because they're basically of the same social class. There is one exception though. How is it that my wife and I met when I grew up in a Montana zip code and she grew up in a New Jersey zip code? Zip code doesn't work. What else do we do with zip codes? Or what else do we do besides zip codes? How do we make sure the right people meet each other? Amy? College, that's right. College is where we sort all this stuff out. Because as we know, when you take those tests, the SATs and all that stuff, it's almost perfectly correlated to wealth, which is probably not surprising if you're in a zip code with like a different school district. And so then you go to, and then our college system becomes exactly as. So yeah, my wife and I met in college where we could be super different, but actually then turn out to be social class endogamous. Guest actually mentions this with the wealthy parents who send their children to elite private schools to meet future partners and encourage in-group marriage. So yeah, the more money, the more you want this to work out, the more you want to make sure that this is all gonna happen. So we have great ways to ensure social class endogamy without even having to say, don't marry that person. I would never marry that person. We don't even have to say it. You just raise your children in your certain zip code. You go to the right schools, send them to the right college. This hasn't worked out that well for Hartwick though, but we could get into why it is. Hartwick is a strange school. We draw people from different zip codes. Anyway, marriage. All right. So in Guest, he covers the issue of monogamy and plural marriage very briefly. In most introductory anthropology textbooks, this is a long section. So I'm going to do it brief too, but some of you wanted to do more about this than Guest did. And I guess that's why Guest kind of abbreviates this. Most marriages worldwide are a form of monogamy, even in societies that permit polygamy. Most marriages in societies that permit or even encourage polygamy are actually one person to one person. In part because most polygamous unions, you have to have a lot of money to pull that off.
Yeah.
And so it's like, you have to be kind of at it's often seen as an ideal, but you have to be super wealthy. For example, in Islamic societies, many of them permit polygamy, but you have to have a house for each additional spouse. And so if you can afford 3 houses, go for it. But who can, right? So it's actually very rare. It's quite rarely done. When we hear the word polygamy, we almost always have one form in mind, which is actually technically called polygyny, as one triangle marrying several circles. One man, both 2 or more wives. So most people, when we think of polygamy, we're actually thinking of polygyny. And, people get down on this and get all weirded out by it. Like I said, it's not as prevalent in other societies as it would be. And if we get weirded out by it, they just say, yeah, but you guys just do serial monogamy, which means you're married to one person for a time, and then you go on to the next person. Many college relationships are like that. So, a much rarer form of marriage, which Guest discussed briefly, but some of you were so interested in it that you had to go look for extra information. It's called polyandry, where one woman gets married to more than one husband at the same time. What do you think, Jada?
Um, It's not really talked as much about compared to like thinking.
Uh-uh.
I feel like there's like the sexist ability that decided to design that as supposed to be like the alpha, like the norm for them to like have multiple women around them, but like the woman is just like, oh, you're supposed to just like be with one man, like be married, like have kids, stuff like that. So it's almost like taboo in like some sort of like cultures or like different like parts of the world, but.
I'm glad you said that. The students are usually not, they don't want me to, they don't believe me when I say this, but I think it is true. There's like this element of this. We expect guys to be like this, but it's kind of seen as taboo for women. So it's, yeah, it's seen as rare. It is rare as a formal marriage system. But there's a classic article. It does appear in several places in the world. The classic article on this is called "When Brothers Share a Wife," and it's actually about, in most cases in which it formally occurs as a marriage system, it's actually called fraternal polyandry. So it's two or more brothers getting married to the same woman. And it's basically a system in which you keep the inheritance, the land, the stuff in the family line. And so then you're not splitting it up.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was, yeah, I talked about that in my response, and specifically, like, kind of surprises me how that's not more common because of how scarce land tends to be in most societies. So you'd think it would be much more beneficial for a lot more families to do that, so they wouldn't, constantly be bickering over land that's practically useless.
Yeah, I mean, it's curious. In most societies in which they value polygamy, it's because they have plenty of land, they don't have enough labor. And so they talk about their labor shortage and their labor needs. The idea that land is scarce is, I guess, I want to say there are places, and there are probably increasing amounts of places, but in most of human history, the shortage has been labor. And so, I mean, I hear what you're saying, and I'll say something about that in a second. Kat, go ahead.
Well, like, I understand if they're like Siamese twins, because sometimes like there's not really an option. But I'm like curious, like in any of these, if you divorce, do you have to pay twice
I mean, so,
or thrice?
like I said, this is a rare form of, this is a pretty rare form of formal marriage engagement. The people who practice it actually say it's not their favorite thing to do. And it's mainly the people who aren't the richest and aren't the poorest, because those people don't care. It's the middle class who are trying to preserve their holdings. And so there are some people who don't like it and they get out of it and they do something else. And, I mean, in some ways, again, there's been an anthropological preoccupation with describing the rules. But what happens if somebody doesn't like the rules in any society? Different things happen. So, but again, this is sort of a classic good explanation for why it happens. I sometimes have assigned that to my intro classes, but the last time I assigned it, a bunch of students felt the need to tell me that they would never do this. And I was like, don't worry, I'm not telling you. This is not, I'm not trying to explain your marriage options here, I'm just trying to help you analyze. I would never do it. I'm like, don't worry, I didn't think you would, but so it's funny. We still, to this day, we still get these little creepy things go on. I'm glad you said that, Josie. You would expect it to be more common, because actually some people have claimed that it is more common than the anthropologists depicted, in the sense that in some societies it has been more prevalent. It just hasn't been formally recognized as a form of marriage. And so there's a number of societies in which people might take on another, well, for reasons that we'll get to, they might call it a second father. And so when a woman is pregnant, you have your primary father, but then you would acquire a second father who would contribute to that relationship. And that seems to work out in some cases where resources are limited. But so it seems to be, as some people have said, it might be more common than what we're looking for in terms of a formal form of marriage. We'll talk about why you can take a second father in a second, but let's just deal with this one here. Guest on page 336 gives us one of the most obvious questions that I think has ever been asked in the guest test book so far. Are biology and marriage the only bases? I think he's pluralizing basis there. Are biology and marriage the only bases for kinship? Louder, Amy.
No.
No. Yes, thank you. No. This is, I'm kind of shaking my own head here. No, they aren't. Why not, Amy?
Food, and they considered you part of their kinship.
You can
From the way village.
eat someone's food. Kinship has to be actively made, even if people consider themselves biologically related. Let's put it this way. You knew from doing your kinship charts, there are all kinds of people that you're technically biologically related to, and you feel very little kinship ties. And there are other people who you might not be related to biologically, but you feel a strong kinship connection, right? And even if you do feel biologically related, it's often something that you have to make and remake. And if you stop doing it, then it becomes not kin anymore. As Amy says, in many societies, providing food, eating food together, sharing food, giving food is seen as an active part, one perhaps the key active ingredient for kinship, a way of, and actually, if you think about it, food is, the ingestion of food is itself a biological thing. Food is what contributes to our blood. So they're not, in fact, even biologically wrong. If we eat the same food together, we're going to share blood. Amy, you mentioned that they also use other things as metaphors like breast milk, which is food, so that would make sense. So someone who might be breastfed by another person would consider that person to be kin. And and that's why you can take a second father, because in some societies, they don't necessarily agree with the idea that reproduction is a one and done thing, that you can just do it once and that's it, that you have to build up the fetus over time with multiple washings of semen. And so if 2 or 3 men do that, it helps to contribute to the baby, and they are your biological parent. I know. Too weird, but just think if this class was at 8:40 in the morning and I had to say it would be terrible. At least we're in the afternoon. So, all right, well, no, we won't say that again. It's not I mean, I know it sounds, we all think we have science and all that, but it's it's an interesting idea. All right, Tiana, what else can we do? Follow that one. Always giving Tiana the worst ones here. What else can we do besides biology, marriage, and food in our lives for kinship relationships? What are other people doing these days?
Like you can kind of choose, but also like the village that Amy had mentioned, like they talked about, they consider like visitors becoming like more part of kinship if they stay longer.
Yeah, I think I was thinking about something you wrote a little bit later, which talked about supplementing this with alternative family forms based on friendship, respect, and mutual support, right? So people that we choose to be with. And in fact, there's an ethnography that Guest mentions by Kath, Weston called Families We Choose, which specifically talked about lesbian and gay kinship and the kinds of families that were being made and why they might not like their families of biological origin. But this, I think, applies broadly speaking, not just to people who identify in the LGBTQ plus community, but to all of us. We have to actively make our kinship, and in some ways we do things like Friendsgiving and all that stuff to supplement or maybe make different kinds of families. Oh, yes. And that applies to those same-sex relationships. Alex, tell us about those.
So I used the quote on 347, opponents raised concern that these alternative kinship patterns would cause the breakdown of the traditional family tree.
Yeah.
And then I continue to say that I'm not an opponent of this, but it is interesting because it does affect the family tree.
Yeah, so yes, you told us that you were not an opponent, but you know, there are opponents out there to same-sex unions still. And you know, the idea was that these changes are going to break down this traditional family, and pretty soon we'll all have social disorder. Everything will go to hell. And so, you know, the idea is these families we choose is leading us in the wrong direction. Now, by traditional family, most of the time, what they are referring to is what anthropologists and others call the nuclear family. And that gets its name from the nucleus. So it's considered, you know, mom, dad, and 2.14 children in our country. So the nuclear family, and they would fasten upon this as the traditional family. Guest cites a really interesting book by Stephanie Kuntz, who's a historian, who talks about, the title is The Way We Never Were. And basically what she's saying is this idea that in the 1950s and Leave It to Beaver and all those television shows that emphasized the nuclear family was actually not what was going on at the time. It was what people believed or wanted to believe was the standard, but there's all sorts of other things happening at the time. And so we fall into this nostalgia trap, believing that that is what a traditional family looks like. I forgot which page number this is on, but I would say, you know, I don't think there is an actual traditional family. I think families come in all kinds of ways. But if we had to go back in time and think about what makes the most sense in terms of families and family organization, it's a more extended family, which might involve aunts, uncles, grandparents, different relatives, people who come in and you just feed them for a while, which would be flexible to changing conditions. And so, yes, it is true that our different ideas about kinship may be changing our ideas about the traditional family and the family tree. Whenever we say that it's going to lead to social disorder, though, we have to realize that we were probably never like that. So let's revisit the idea of kinshipology and anthropology. What the anthropologists thought when they were going out and doing these kinship charts was basically a form of heteronormativity, that people came in circles and triangles, and that those circles and triangles, when they got together, produced other circles and triangles, etc. And they believed that if you organize your society in a certain way, that meant you were more civilized. And if you didn't have the right kinship terms, if you called everybody in your father's generation father, that meant that you were somehow involved in some weird primitive promiscuity. And if you didn't understand reproduction, then that meant you were backwards or terrible. And it involved a hierarchy of social forms. So if somebody said, yeah, well, you know, we believe that people might have more than one wife or more than one husband, we'd get all moralistic about that. So this was kind of the assumption that many anthropologists and many people began with when they talked about kinship. And I think to this day, some of the findings of anthropology are eye-opening to people. I was surprised at how many of you in your comments used words like shocked or surprised that people had different forms like unilineal or different forms of family. So what did they find? They found an enormous amount of cultural variability in the way that people organize their kinship systems and their social groups. They might be matrilineal, they might be patrilineal, they might like their matrilateral cross cousins. They also found that people changed in a non-directional way. It wasn't necessarily they were all heading toward the same kinship system, and there wasn't any ranking of societies based on how they reckoned their kin or did their marriages. That there were lots of ways in which kinship and different things could work. And so, as I just talked about, in many societies, an extended family might be a more flexible adaptation to the conditions. Or even a polyandrous family might be a workable idea. I'm not telling you to do it, but it might work in certain cases, right? And so you have this whole thing where anthropologists, and a lot of you said this is why I think a lot of anthropologists ended up liking studying kinship, because it showed to us how variable people were. Now, this is still good to this day. And I think it is great when it helps us to fight those ethnocentric ideas out there that certain people's relationships are wrong, or that the way you do kin is wrong, or that you're backwards or illegitimate or evil or whatever. It's great when we use anthropological findings to fight that kind of ethnocentrism and determinism. What is not so great is when the findings of anthropology become a new kind of determinism, and you say, ah, yes, well, people with matrilineal societies are always going to marry this, or the reason their society can't do anything is because they marry their cross kin, and you know what happened, you know. So if it becomes a new determinism, that becomes a problem.